Good evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, where I live, work and write, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are here with us tonight. Welcome. And welcome to another issue of Your Library at Home. My name is Rachel Franks. I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales. And this is a brand new series tonight, which is people have been beavering away on for many months now. And it is great to have your company this evening to celebrate the first episode of Travels to the Past, a Foreign Country. And I think I've still got that wrong. I'm sorry. Will Christie is a professor at the Australian National University, and he's been working to curate this very special series for the library. And hosting you this evening is Richard Neville. Now, Richard will be known to many of you as the Mitchell Librarian or as one of Australia's leading art historians with a specialisation in J.M. Lewin. If you have any questions for Will this evening after his lecture, please use the chat feature on Zoom, and Richard will be back at the end to ask those questions. Thanks very much. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Rachel, and I also extend my warm welcome to all our visitors tonight. I'm on Darug country. I can imagine that many of you are spread throughout this nation and on many Aboriginal nations. It is, as Rachel said, a really important night for us tonight because we are launching Will's A Foreign Country Travels Through the Past series. Will Christie has put this series together for us, and we're excited to be able to offer really a new perspective on matters that are involved and concerned with libraries and indeed our collections. Will, as some of you may know, is a graduate of the Universities of Sydney and Oxford. He's an emeritus professor at Australian National Universities, and he was the head of the Humanities Research Centre from 2015 to 2021. He was also the founding president of the Romantic Studies Association of Australasia from 2010 to 2015. And his scholarly work in Romantic studies, across many other fields, has been widely published. Will is also the director of the Australasian Consortium for Humanities Research Centres and coordinator of the Romanticism section of the International Association of University Professors of English, on the International Advisory Board for the journal European Romantic Review, and the general editor of the series China and the West in the Modern World. He was elected a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 2011. Tonight, Will is going to talk in this public lecture about public lecturing. And I think it's irony in a way that this was actually, had the pandemic not resurfaced, going to be held in person. Tonight, of course, we are all very familiar with the idea of the public lecture on a virtual circuit. I'm delighted that we have Will Christie with us tonight. So I'm handing you over to Will, and I hope to see you at the end of the evening for any questions you may have. Will.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Rachel. I'm delighted to be here, and good evening to everybody who is here. I'm going to share my screen with you straight away. I'm afraid I'm going to disappear behind my screen and will be lecturing to you from the side. But bear with me. You should be able to. That should be at the center of your screen. Okay, now before I begin, let me just briefly introduce our mini-series of lectures. A Foreign Country Travels Through the Past, to be held fortnightly on Tuesday evenings from now to the 9th of November. Now, you may have recognised in my title the reference to the opening of L.P. Hartley's novel, The Go-Between. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And so they do, but not so differently that we can't learn their language and familiarize ourselves with their cultural practices, and in doing so, learn something about ourselves. This series of 6 lectures is the offering of 6 scholars from a variety of universities and representing different disciplines in the humanities: English and Australian literature, economic and colonial history, art history and theory, journalism, all of them sharing an interest in what we call, or might broadly call, cultural history, and a concern with the way that history can tell us something about ourselves and about the choices we can and should be making. As it happens, all of our speakers are currently working together on a project investigating the complex and inherently human challenges of things like knowledge, credibility and communication, historical commemoration and social cohesion, convinced that they lie at the heart of the mutual and often willful misunderstanding that seems characteristic of today's fractured societies. Now, my brief for these lectures couldn't have been simpler. I have invited each speaker to talk about something of interest to them, on the understanding that our human sympathy will transform it into something of interest to all of us. Okay, now I've told you why we are all here. Let me start my public lecture on public lecturing by asking you to think about why you are all here. Why do we attend public lectures at all? Now, a lecture in the Middle Ages, like this one, bear with me, this one, a lecture in the Middle Ages was what its etymological derivation from the Latin legere, to read, lectio, lectura, suggests. It was a reading out loud of a canonical or authoritative text, usually from one of a very limited number of manuscript copies, and possibly with the interpolation of some kind of commentary, a sort of the equivalent of a textual gloss. But even before the invention of the printing press, even before we could mass produce books, the systematic reproduction of documents by hand meant at least the limited availability of written texts for private reading. It's interesting to look at the way those students here at Bologna have texts in front of them. In other words, the written word has been more or less accessible for some centuries now, depending on whether or not you could get your hands on the text itself. And that was an issue that was partly technological and partly economic. And of course, depending on whether or not you could read. Now, these days, with the availability of literature, thanks to institutions like the State Library of New South Wales, and thanks to the spread of literacy, we tend to take these things for granted. But this only gives us an added urgency to my opening question. Why on earth do we attend lectures? If someone has anything of interest to say, surely they can write it down and circulate or sell it. Do you need to go through the painful ritual of listening to what lecturers like me have to say, spoken and read, or read out loud? Now, the Romantic essayist Charles Lamb certainly didn't think so. Lectures are not much to my taste, said Lamb, whatever the lecturer may be. If read, they are dismal flat. And you can't think why you are brought together to hear a man read his works, which you could read so much better at leisure yourself. If delivered extempore, I am always in pain lest the gift of utterance should suddenly fail the orator in the middle, as it did me at a dinner once, given in honour to me at the London Tavern. Gentlemen, said I, and there I stopped. Now, in this letter to Dorothy Wordsworth of February 1818, Lamb is talking specifically about public lecturing. It's a cultural phenomenon that dates roughly from the early 17th century. And our virtual gathering here this evening is proof that the public lecture has not died out altogether. Far from it. In fact, for further proof, we need go no further than the likes of natural historian David Attenborough or the astronomer Brian Cox on mainstream television, and a proliferating host of TEDx lecturers on the YouTube discoursing on every conceivable topic under and over the sun. The technology might be more sophisticated, but the motivation in sharing knowledge and the more or less interactive scenario of lecturer and audience are still the same. Now, if you'd been in London earlier this year, or online at any time since the 19th of May, you would have been entitled, simply by virtue of being a member of the public, to a free public lecture on the way, and I'm going to quote, on the way the detection of gravitational waves from cosmic coalescences comprises an entirely new type of astronomy. It was a free public lecture given in the City of London by Catherine Blundell, one of Britain's foremost science communicators. As well as being Professor of Astrophysics at the University of Oxford, Catherine is the Gresham Professor of Astronomy. You could also have heard the Gresham Professor of Music, Marina Frolova-Walker, talking about Russian piano masterpieces, or the UK's Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, lecturing as the Gresham Professor of Physics on major debates in public health. Now, the reason I mention the Gresham professors is because I want to use them to introduce my history of public lecturing. As some of you will be aware, the Gresham professors have been delivering free public lectures in the City of London for over 400 years. And if you look on its website, you'll see that Gresham College lays claim to being London's oldest higher education institution. As it happens, it is not a chartered university, nor has it ever issued degrees or diplomas of any kind. The college is named after Sir Thomas Gresham, there, the founder of the Royal Exchange, the founder of the stock market. In his mercantile success, Gresham dreamt of establishing an educational legacy. Now, thinking at first to endow his old University of Cambridge, in the end, he decided and made the symbolic choice of London's business district, ordaining in his will that on the death of his wife, his Bishopsgate house and the rents from the shops around the Royal Exchange should be vested in perpetuity in the hands of the City of London Corporation and the Mercers Company. And they would in turn appoint 7 Gresham professors to give free public lectures on the 7 sciences: astronomy, divinity, geometry, law, music, physics, and rhetoric. Each lecture was to be delivered twice on a different day, once in Latin, partly for the foreigners, because Latin was, of course, a lingua franca, once in Latin, and originally with an epitome in English, but ultimately in an English version. So Gresham College came into being. Gresham College came into being, with the first professors occupying their chambers in March 1597. It was Gresham College that housed the group of natural philosophers, or what we would call scientists, that in 1660 would metamorphose into the Royal Society. And the college numbered amongst its professors Sir Christopher Wren, the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral, and Robert Hooke, who opened up the microscopic world of nature in his famous Micrographia. To this day, Gresham College is governed by a council with the Lord Mayor of London as its president, and the City of London Corporation is committed to promoting public enlightenment. Now, Gresham College was in many ways exceptional, but when it opened in 1597, public lectures on diverse topics had been available in Britain at least since Thomas Linacre returned from the continent in the late 15th century, when he began to deliver his extramural shagling lectures in Oxford, extramural outside the colleges. Shagling because he was probably wearing civvies, not in his clerical garb. In London itself, public lectures were introduced in the late 16th century, again before the foundation of Gresham College, to target specific needs, like the free public lectures in navigational mathematics established by Thomas Smith in 1588 in the wake of the threatened invasion of the Spanish Armada. In the late 17th century, public lectures were being offered in Oxford and Cambridge, partly to take learning outside college walls, as Linacre had done, and partly to make up for deficiencies in the formal instruction offered by the two universities. The coffee houses, which sprang up around the middle of the 17th century and proliferated and flourished into the 18th century, were renowned as venues for public lectures, like those that Peter Stahl delivered on chemistry in Tilliard's Coffee House in Oxford from 1659 through to the 1660s. Now, the 18th century witnessed a marked shift from these large-scale philanthropic institutional initiatives like Gresham College, a shift from institutional initiatives towards private enterprise, with the public lecturer as a sole trader, offering different courses of lectures in venues as humble as private houses and private laboratories, as unlikely as pubs, and as grand as the Theatre of Science at 97 Pall Mall and the Theatre Royal at Haymarket. Lectures could be found everywhere. And this was especially true of what we call the sciences. The role of 18th century public lecturing in the dissemination of new scientific knowledge and the reinforcement of the new scientific method has been well established and well documented for some decades now. Addressing a vast range of contemporary interests, optics and mechanics, chemistry, astronomy, later electricity, not only did the public lecture allow the natural philosopher to share his observation and experimentation with an audience, but scientific progress itself was dependent on the demonstration and replication that amounted to scientific proof. For the discoveries of an Isaac Newton or a Joseph Priestley to become established, the authentication of experimental repetition and replication was required. Now, of the many public lecturers on natural philosophy, and we are talking at least scores, if not hundreds, of the many public lecturers on natural philosophy or science in the first half of the 18th century, John Theophilus Desaguliers, oh, lost him. There he is. John Theophilus Desaguliers, I should say, was first among equals. Though his nominal vocation was that of an Anglican priest, Desaguliers' real talent and passion lay in the experimental sciences. He was a protege and laboratory assistant of Isaac Newton, and from 1714 a member of the Royal Society, where he filled the post of curator of experiments and was 3 times awarded the prestigious Copley Medal. Desaguliers sort of set himself up as a public lecturer in natural philosophy in London in 1715, moving his classes later to the Bedford Coffee House in Covent Garden. And his reputation as a lecturer with everyone from royalty and his scientific peers to the educated public at large was in part dependent on the spectacle of experiments for which, like many of his contemporaries, he was obliged to design and develop his own instruments. And by 1734, 19 years after setting up as a lecturer, he had delivered as many as 121 courses of lectures. That's hundreds and hundreds of lectures. When he died, when Desaguliers died around the middle of the 18th century, the latest developments in chemistry and physics, and especially in electricity, were all the rage. Public lectures in science, to quote Thomas Kelly, became so widespread that a detailed record is impossible. Desaguliers' occasional journeys around England and Europe made him one of the earliest of a large and expanding class of itinerant public lecturers in the sciences, like, next one, whoop, we've lost it, there we go, like Henry Moyes, the blind Henry Moyes, I should say, the blind Henry Moyes, who crisscrossed not just England, but Europe and America as well, and the equally well-known John Walter and Adam Walker there. All of them itinerant public lecturers. And all of them, particularly Moyes, linking up with provincial scientists like Erasmus Darwin, Josiah Wedgwood, James Watt and Joseph Priestley in the Lunar Society of Birmingham. All of the itinerant lecturers delivered extracurricular science lectures at different secondary schools around the country because it wasn't, of course, a part of the normal school curriculum. And Walker, who started lecturing in 1762, was still going strong when at the age of 77, he lectured to Percy Bysshe Shelley as a schoolboy at Sion House in 1808. Now, if natural philosophy or science was the most common topic of public lecturing in the 18th century, it was by no means the only one. And I've written elsewhere, for example, on the development of the school and university discipline of English out of public lecturing on variously Shakespeare, antiquarian book and manuscript history, the history of literature, rhetoric and belles lettres, and elocution. Okay. At the Oratory in Newport Market this evening, here is an advertisement from the Daily Post of 12th of April, 1727. The oration will be a panegyric on Shakespeare, especially with regard to his morality, and an account of the nature, judgment, and rise of tragedy. This kind of public lecture was available throughout the 18th century. Literary lectures increased dramatically during the Romantic period, and by the middle of the 19th century would overtake lectures on science in popularity. But already by the 18th century, it didn't matter what the topic might have been. Anything from insects to angels, someone could always be found to lecture to their fellow citizens, just as I'm doing now. The circulation of bodies of knowledge via complex social networks of itinerant public lecturers connecting London, Glasgow, and Edinburgh with the provinces and connecting Britain to the continent and later in the 18th century to the United States, all this amounted to what as early as 1631 Sir George Buck was calling the Third University of England. One that doesn't feature in conventional histories of education, and one that uniquely included literate, middle, and upper class women. Now, most accounts of female education rightly deplore the limited institutional opportunities available to women, concentrating on the limited resources and less encouragement that women received from the family and from society more generally. What is distinctive about the practice or the cultural practice of public lecturing is precisely the opportunity it offered women to be part of the audience, I hasten to qualify, not to lecture themselves. That opportunity would have to wait until the middle of the 19th century. But already in the advertisements of the late 17th century, we find differential pricing designed to attract women to attend the lectures. And we find the likes of Joseph Addison and Richard Steele in the early 18th century recommending lectures to their female readers and celebrating the intellectual opportunities offered women by polite society. But before I offer any more general reflections on the nature and significance of public lecturing, let me quickly bring this history up to the early 19th century or the Romantic period. Ideas, information, and critical opinions were the social currency of an expanding public sphere throughout the 18th century. And by the Romantic period, the production and consumption of knowledge in Britain's thriving culture of public lecturing testifies to an economic and emotional investment in knowledge of all kinds, as well as in knowledge for its own sake. Where the 18th century was marked by the public lecturer as sole trader, the early 19th century witnessed a shift back to the institutionalization of public lecturing, effectively reinventing large-scale social initiatives like Sir Thomas Gresham's. This new episode in the cultural history of public lecturing conventionally begins in 1799 with the foundation of the Royal Institution, though the Royal Institution was itself indebted to Anderson's Institution, or the Andersonian Institute of Glasgow, founded in 1796 by the Professor of Natural Philosophy at Glasgow, John Anderson. By the second decade of the 19th century, a number of institutions had sprung up to house, foster, and fund courses in public lectures. But the foremost, if not the first of these institutions, was the Royal. The noonday opera house, in the words of one of its literary lecturers. It was the Royal Institution where the scientist Humphrey Davy and the social critic, Sidney Smith established extensive reputations among the educated public for chemistry and moral philosophy, respectively, and to which Humphrey Davy invited the poet and literary critic Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who began his famous literary lectures there in 1808. The Royal Institution was the brainchild of the eccentric Count Mumford, who, along with a group of fellows of the Royal Society, including Sir Joseph Banks, and a handful of distinguished citizens like the wealthy benefactor, Sir Thomas Bernard, founded the Royal Institution as a centre, and I quote, for diffusing knowledge and facilitating the general introduction of useful mechanical inventions and improvements. Originally designed to offer lectures and workshops to a socially diverse audience, including tradespeople and the labouring classes, by 1802, the philanthropic motive had been outvoted. And the Royal Institution, with its state-of-the-art lecture theatre and laboratories, its extensive library and its reading rooms, became both a distinguished research institute in chemistry in its own right and a venue in which an as yet undivided scientific and literary culture met the world of fashion. Not all the institutions of the early 19th century had the Royal Institution's aristocratic backing and aristocratic image. The Surrey Institution, for example, there is the Surrey's Rotunda, the famous Rotunda in the Surrey Institution. The Surrey Institution, where Coleridge and William Hazlitt delivered lectures on literature at different times, was created by the merchants, bankers and manufacturers of the City of London, who comprised their own alternative social order. Its geographical position south of the Thames made the Surrey Institution unthinkable to some of the upper class members of London society, a reminder that the dissemination of knowledge has always been subject to class inflections. The Russell Institution, on the other hand, launched in the same year as the Surrey, 1808, was founded on Bloomsbury Square by Whig professional intellectuals, lawyers, many of them. But as you can see from the rotunda here in front of you, the Surrey and the Russell were still fashionable institutions. and a long way from offering the form of working men's education that, though underway by the late 18th century, thanks to the Andersonian Institute, would have to wait for the foundation of the Mechanics Institutes in 1823. The obvious beneficiaries of the institutionalized public lecture system were not the working people of the Royal Institution's original proposal, but as I suggested earlier, it was well-to-do women. Okay, there's my brief history of public lecturing, bringing us roughly up to the Romantic period. The reason I stopped there is partly to do with the fact that in the 19th century, it becomes such a popular cultural form and it proliferates to such an extent that it is really quite impossible to offer anything like a coherent account of its development. This is particularly true, as many of you will be aware, in the United States with what they call their Lyceum culture. I want to wind up my brief history of the public lecture by returning to the question that I opened with. Why, with the technologies of writing and print available to us, do we attend public lectures at all? 50 years before Charles Lamb, Dr. Johnson was also complaining that he could not see that lectures can do so much good as reading the books from which the lectures are taken. Why not just read the book? The main impulse behind the modern institution of the public lecture and what we might call its official rationale is public enlightenment. What today we would call, in a rather chilling phrase, knowledge transfer. But while the transfer of knowledge is its primary justification, the public lecture, I think you'll agree, is so much more. An intellectual event, certainly, but also it's a performance. It's a performance before a specific and live audience, to quote Donald Scott. Now, let me close my brief by briefly considering the lecture as a performance, what Scott elsewhere calls intellectual theatricality. Intellectual theatricality. Now, the first thing to recognize, to register, is that as public entertainment, the sciences clearly had and still have distinct advantages over the humanities and the arts. In the 18th and 19th centuries, able lecturers were able to adapt the latest experimental researches to the expectations of an audience hungry for surprise and spectacle. With a bank of the latest voltaic batteries stored in the cellar of the Royal Institution and powering his visual appliances, Humphrey Davy projected his theme in sonne lumiere. The pile could produce shocks, sparks of a dazzling brightness, and loud noises, just to entertain his audience. Today, David Attenborough and Brian Cox deploy camera teams that any earnest public lecturer would die for. However, as the success of Sidney Smith and the occasional success of Samuel Taylor Coleridge in the Romantic period confirms, the older special effects of language and rhetoric, wit and verbal image, passion and persona could be just as dazzling and just as convincing as the experimental pyro or electro techniques of science on display. Indeed, so much so that long before it became fashionable during the Romantic period, the public lecture was an object of deep suspicion to many cultural commentators. In some cases, an object of contempt. And a good deal of the doubt surrounding its reputation can be attributed to this theatrical element, especially in what we might call the idiot fringe, the purveyors of fake truth, the medical miracle workers, the self-titled experts with an answer to everything. They were there in the 17th and 18th century. They are still with us. But it was and is not just quacks who resort to theatricality. And for more serious-minded commentators, the theatricality and the celebrity culture growing up around fashionable lecturers is incompatible with serious intellectual endeavour, making it impossible to reconcile the Enlightenment mission with its entertainment motive. But the personal gratification and social function of the public lecture, or public lectures more generally, are more various and complex than any single explanation is likely to acknowledge, or so it seems to me. To recognise this, we need to shift the emphasis off the lecturer as performer to the audience as agent, to you, from me to you, and to ask, as I did at the opening, why people choose to attend public lectures. We need to ask, borrowing a term from the social sciences, we need to ask what the uses and gratifications that it offers are. Now, all of these, cognitive needs, affective needs, personal integrative needs, social integrative, tension release needs, all of these, I'm going to suggest to you, can be satisfied by the public lecture as a form of intellectual sociability. The gratification or pleasure offered by the lecture plays an important role in the complicated erotics that inform and arguably drive our search for knowledge and understanding. The lecture offers first and foremost the primitive pleasure of knowing and understanding, the pleasure that Aristotle celebrates in the famous opening of his Metaphysics. All men, says Aristotle, by nature, desire to know. More than this, however, a palpable somatic or bodily pleasure comes from accessing that knowledge and understanding. Like Eros, writes George Steiner, but with greater enforcement and at greater private or public cost, this tireless inquiry into being and substance, this, in some sense, maniacal lunge after intelligibility is non-negotiable. Disinterested cerebral and sensory passion can no more be explained than love. It relates to our acceptance and denial of death in ways we can mythologize, but not altogether comprehend. The accession of an idea, any idea, though some are more equal than others, the accession of an idea brings with it a pleasure that is no less somatic, bodily, than it is intellectual, insofar as the two can be separated at all. And along with the pleasure of knowing something we did not know before comes the instructive or formative pleasure of the experience of thinking itself, of using the mind. But I hear you say that the pleasure can come no less from reading a book than from listening to ideas in a lecture hall. A second and characteristic intensification of the intellectual pleasure that's offered by a lecture comes from the vocal, comes from what Roland Barthes called language lined with flesh. Excuse me. A text where we can hear the grain of the throat, the patina of consonants, the voluptuousness of vowels, a whole carnal stereophony, a whole carnal stereophony. From Plato to Wittgenstein, to quote Steiner again, the ideal of lived truth is one of orality, the voice, of face-to-face address and response, something we would do well to remember in our Zoom-bound cultural condition. Ultimately, then, we are weighing into the ancient quarrel between the spoken and the written word. But who could doubt that even the arrangements and flow of language in composition as well as speech have a connection and dependence on the cultivation of the faculty of oral utterance? I'm quoting from the Romantic elocutionist John Thelwall. Even the arrangements and flow of language in composition as well as speech have a connection and dependence on the cultivation of the faculty of oral utterance. What he's saying is that utterance and eloquence are inextricable. And even the written text, the text that we read, is haunted by the ghost of its oral utterance. Again and again, we hear the pleasure derived from public lecturing either attributed to or associated with, and I quote, the charm of voice and manner of delivery, to quote Saba Holland on her father, Sidney Smith. But it's more than just voice, of course. There is also what we suggestively call body language, physical appearance, physical gesture, eye contact. And then there is attitude in both, or at least all, the senses of the word. The scenario of the lecture, says Diana Taylor there, the scenario of the lecture includes features well theorized in literary analysis, such as narrative and plot, but also demands that we pay attention to the milieu and corporeal behaviors, such as gestures, attitudes, and tones not reducible to language. A total physical experience. What Sean Francel calls the oral eventfulness of the Romantic public lecture, the oral eventfulness of the Romantic public lecture, was the Romantics' answer to my opening question of why we attend lectures at all. Now, I wrote this lecture in lockdown from the COVID-19 virus, which has precipitated a shift online and a radical rethinking of conventional modes of sharing knowledge. My sense of the complex social and educative experience of the lecture will make it very clear that I think we should be cautious about abandoning the lecture as live performance altogether. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Great, thanks. Well, that's a fascinating account of something I think we've all been trying to do over the past COVID, really, isn't it? And we've all kind of moved online. So if any of you have any questions, please feel free to send them in. We do have a few. Someone's asked, and it's certainly something I see with my own children who are now at university, that of course their kind of entire experience, in fact my son who spent 2 years at university has lived entirely online in his experience of the lecture. And the question is really, I know he finds it a very unappealing way of learning. How do we actually, but it's just the kind of way it is now, how do we encourage people to about the value of the live lecture, and how do we persuade them that there is something to be said for being in the room with the person who is talking to you?
Yeah. Thank you, Richard, and thank you for the question. As a university teacher, of course, this is an argument that's been going on a lot longer than COVID-19. We can go right back to certainly when I started university in 1970. Even then, as I recall, there were whole questions about the efficacy of lecturing. right? And the question of what it actually contributed. And there have different times, I think there's been a sort of a welling up of resistance to the concept of the lecture at all, because it's sort of authoritative, it centralizes one voice, it's not effectively, though of course I think we all know that some lectures can be more interactive than others. It's jolly hard when you're on a webinar to be genuinely interactive, because you haven't got all those cues that I was talking about at the end there, the bodily aspects of the interaction. But there have been questions about its educational efficacy from the beginning. It wasn't just COVID and the movement online that raised questions about traditional approaches to disseminating knowledge and things. Having said that, I think that what I was trying to say at the end there, and while my focus is actually on public lectures, we know that academic lectures are a different thing entirely. I'm talking about public lectures, but they still share at least that motivation. I was talking about that official motivation of enlightenment, of sharing knowledge. I think what I was trying to say, that there are a variety of things happening within the lecture beyond the simple knowledge transfer that we crudely talk about these days, and that we have to be aware of its very complex sort of social functions and individual functions. And how do we convince people? That's a very good question, because I think that we all know that there's a lot of pressure on both universities, but beyond universities, to try and simplify, and certainly to move online in ways where we'd have to say the lecture form has been threatened. It has been for about 10 or 15 years now, because of the recording of lectures at various institutions, and the option of attending or not attending lectures, which I think has already changed, long before COVID-19 had already changed the relationship, as it were, between the individual student and knowledge itself. And while I can see the virtue of all of that, I think that for all those social reasons, I think that there is something to be gained if we keep the public lecture as part of our way of talking to each other.
And it's certainly true. I have another comment, I suppose, in a way that many university lecturers could do with some training in dramatic and presenting in a way that is engaging for their students, because I think we've all suffered the variability of the lecture in the university setting. Another question, I mean, I was interested in your image of the, I think it was a Surrey Rotunda, indeed, how many women were sitting in that particular audience.
Huge numbers of women, yes.
I presume that was a purpose-built facility for lecturing, was it?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Yes, it was. It was originally a museum, and when it was started, when the Surrey Institution started, they adapted that room, and it became quite a famous lecture theatre at the time. And it's interesting. I have actually counted the number of women and men there. There are more women than men in that rotunda. I should also say, I didn't expand too much, but a lot of the sort of satire that we get in the Romantic period is, of course, attacking public lectures, largely because of the fact that women was so popular amongst women. So you can imagine that drew the scorn of conservative contemporaries and things like that.
And do we know how the audiences were behaved? I mean, did they, like the theatre was allegedly quite a vocal place. Were people prepared to?
It was probably more vocal. We've only got evidence. I mean, my knowledge comes largely through literary lecturing, because I'm a professor of English literature, so I know about Hazlitt and I know about Coleridge, and I know that that frequently both of those lecturers would stray, or they would offer something parenthetically that might have been offensive to part of the audience, and the audience would have yelled out "shame" or something to that effect, just to let them know that they weren't allowed to get away with it. So there was by and large that sort of that performance element as part of it as well, so that the lecturer would be responding to an audience that might start to become hostile, and therefore, would have to decide. Hazlitt clearly did it provocatively at times. He got people upset. He meant to get people upset. I suspect that Coleridge probably couldn't help himself occasionally.
Was there a natural length for a lecture? I mean, you sometimes read in 19th century that 19th century public lectures went on, and there was a degree of press criticism of that. Was there a kind of natural length for a lecture? Was an hour? I mean, we now think an hour is where we should.
Oh, I see what you. Yeah, yes. They were, unlike though they tolerated much longer performances in the theatre, for example, where they would pile on, as you're probably aware, Richard, they would sort of pile on a number of things which would exhaust us. They seem to have, sort of an extraordinary sort of concentration and patience compared with a modern audience. And lectures could go on. They could be foreshortened. They could extend, but they would have been around our hour. Some no doubt less, and some twice as long, or even longer, depending partly on the context, partly on the topic, partly on the audiences. There was still that interactive element that the lecture might be shaped by. I mean, part of our problem is, of course, that by nature or by definition, we haven't got the lecture itself. Even the written version, if we were to use the written version of some lectures, and many, not by no means all, but many would go on to sort of publish their lectures later, we don't know how far that reflects what was actually delivered in the theatre itself, and how far that was massaged subsequent to the lecture. So it's really hard to tell exactly always, but it's usually, if you measure it from diaries and things, when people sort of talk about coming out of a lecture, it would have been around that period, around that hour.
Right. And I mean, the idea of the TED Talk now, or the short and sweet kind of idea, the question here is, I mean, I suppose in a way, in contrast to the hour talk, is the TED Talk, which is very short and sweet.
Yes.
Obviously, the kind of platform allows them to speak to many more people, so perhaps the impact is greater. What, in one sense, in the 18th century lecture, do we know what the impact of the lecture actually was? I mean, you couldn't record, in a TED Talk, it goes out and people can come back to it and look at it.
Yeah.
Delivery of the lecture.
I'd go back to the evidence that we use for many things, Richard, many things to do with past culture, and look for diaries and autobiographies and look in there to see what we. I was talking, remember, about particularly about the popularity of the sciences in the 17th and 18th century, and there were clearly effects, run-on effects from the lectures that were being delivered in the science, not by everybody by any means, but by a lot of the public lectures that were being delivered at the time, because they were part of sort of, as it were, larger projects, if you see what I mean. Yes. And there was also a lot of public lecturing that was going on. I mean, for example, in the Scottish universities in the 18th century, there's a lot more public lecturing going on than we have got a record of, because it wasn't uncommon for lecturers to offer extramural talks and things like that. But in terms of how effective it was, how influential it was, we can only go on things like diaries, but we can go on the work that's being done in the sciences in the 17th and 18th century. And clearly, a lot of those public lectures are dealing with new knowledge that subsequently becomes established and developed. And is part of, is an effective conduit for the latest experiment and the latest knowledge. So from that point of view, we get indications. Not all lectures by any means. I think that I would stress again the sheer number of these, but certainly many lectures would have been effective, and we can judge by things like, say, the literary lectures in the Romantic period, that people were certainly there. They were responding. They were making notes. I mean, you could argue that the poetry of John Keats was deeply influenced by William Hazlitt's lectures on Shakespeare and on other literary texts and things like that. So we've got individual cases where there is a clear connection, but by and large, we are reliant, as it were, on the reflections and records of individuals who actually attended the lectures. Not a huge amount of material, but there's enough to suggest that obviously it did make a difference.
And I only got time for one sort of quick more question, I suppose, but I think you've said through your talk that possibly, particularly in the 18th century, and I wonder if the access to the published work would have had an impact on this, but the public lectures were not as accessible to working class people as the case, say, the 19th century lecture would have been.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. Sorry, that I should have been a bit clearer about that. Anderson's the Andersonian Institute of 1796 is probably not the first, but certainly the best known, that quite self-consciously addressed itself to the labouring classes and to people who wouldn't have. I mean, Scotland, of course, has a much longer history of education and extending its education across different classes, and it is characteristic that John Anderson should have started his institute in the 70s. So 1796, which is to say at the very end of the 18th century, and it's not until 1823 the Mechanics Institutes, when working people started to, as it were, lecture to themselves and to employ and engage lecturers to come to them to give them knowledge, that it really starts to pick up momentum and things like that. No, it's not at all common in the 18th century. It just becomes, like so many aspects of our culture, it just becomes more so as time goes on. And it's partly to do with sort of philanthropic gestures, and partly to do with sort of working people developing the agency and the nous, as it were, and taking it into their own hands, which they did more and more in the 19th century.
Okay, well, I think that's probably all we've got time for. Our next lecture will be on the 14th of September, which is Anna Johnson. And her lecture is at the same time as the Platypus Journal and the Felon Press, Science and Print Culture in Colonial Tasmania. And it's wonderful to have you with us tonight, Will, and thank you for curating this series. I think it's interesting indeed that it's being held at the State Library, because certainly in the 19th century,
exactly,
the library itself had those very debates about whether it was servicing the middle classes or the working classes. And when it became a free public library in 1870, it was explicitly hoped that the working classes would make more of it than they had in the past, because it was full of fiction, which of course was immoral and wrong.
Exactly.
Well, that's been a fabulous lecture. Really enjoyed it. We hope to see you and all our listeners, all the audience, in the ongoing series, the next 5 lectures. It's a great start, and I think we'll call it quits there. So good night, and thank you, everyone. Thanks, Will.
Everybody for coming. Thank you.